Hey friends, welcome back to Midweek as we continue through our series titled Faith Deconstructed. Now last week we introduced this series by talking about the importance of what it means to define our terms. What is deconstruction? Well, we talked about that last week and we introduced that a healthy definition and an unhealthy definition. You may want to go back and check out that video to make sense of a little bit of what we're talking about tonight. Because tonight we're doing the same thing, except we're going to define what we're deconstructing from. And so this is the idea of evangelicalism. If I were to ask you, hey, could you define for me what an evangelical is? You probably wouldn't be able to define it. And don't feel bad about it because I can't either. In fact, it's such a broad terminology that I doubt anybody can define what it means to be an evangelical. In fact, if someone asks you if you are an evangelical, you may be better off by asking them what they mean by an evangelical, because it's such a broad definition. And what I mean by that is that the culture, America, has just kind of put everyone who calls themselves Christian into this hodgepodge and called it evangelicalism. And so if you claim to be a Christian or a Christ follower, then by default, you are an evangelical. Now, for me, I don't claim that definition. What I tell people I am is a Christ follower. I am a Christian. That's literally the definition. I am a follower of Christ, one who's come to pave the way. I believe he's fully God. I believe he's fully human, and he is out there paving the way, and I want to do everything I can to mold my life and my behavior after his, right? That's what it means to be a Christ follower. So I am, by definition, a Christian. But let's talk about this idea of evangelicalism. What is it? Well, there was a ministry called Legionnaire Ministries who is partnered with Lifeway Research, and in 2022, they went out and tried to do a study just to figure out what is it that evangelicals believe. What is it that the American Christian claims to believe? And here is what they found. They found that 56% of the evangelical Christians, right, this is that broad term, 56% of them believe that God accepts the worship of all religions, right? So whether you're an Islam, whether you're a Jew, whether you're a Christian, a Buddhist, a Hindu, whatever it may be, regardless of your religious status, there is one God who accepts the worship of all. So all of it is okay. All of it is acceptable. There's one universal God. 56% of the American people that call themselves a Christian, according to this research, believe that to be true. Staggering to me, right? They found that 43% of the Christians believe that Jesus was just a good person, a good teacher, but he was not God. Right? Jesus had no divinity. He had no association with God. He's not God incarnate. He's just a really good teacher. And 43% of the people who call themselves Christians in America believe that. And then thirdly, they found that 38% of the people believe that religious belief is nothing more than just an opinion. Right? Now, we talked about this idea and where this concept comes from. It comes from Satan. We talked about that last week. But do you see how much of a problem that is when you loosely throw people into this hodgepodge of a term called evangelical? Because out of all those three things that most people in America are claiming, none of those apply to me, right? And I hope that none of those apply to you either. But that's the danger of identifying this idea of evangelicalism. And so you may want to reconsider telling people that you're an evangelical, because here's what they do. They associate evangelicalism with things like white supremacy or the idea that a woman needs to be submissive to a man. And they put all these labels and these legalisms and all these things that's associated with that term. It's gotten so badly that even today, if you claim to vote for Donald Trump, for one, you're just an evangelical conservative, right? Associated with white supremacy and masculinity and all that other garbage that they associate with that term. So it's almost more dangerous to consider yourself an evangelical than anything else. You may want to stick with the term Christian, right? And so not too long ago, there was a college student. His name was Blake Chastain, and he went to college. He grew up in a Christian home, and he was considered an evangelical. And so he went out there and he started doing things, but in college is when he started to deconstruct his faith. And he actually came up with a hashtag called #exvangelical, meaning he's deconstructed from the faith, and now he's created this hashtag that gets over 100,000 hits per day. 100,000 hits per day on all these social media platforms of people who are trying to deconstruct from their faith using the hashtag exvangelical. And so That's where this whole thing is coming from. But here's what he says they're walking away from, right? He's kind of one of the leaders of the movement. But here's what he says they're walking away from. They're walking away from the concept of the Bible being a literal reading, that people shouldn't read the Bible literally. That's what they're walking away from. He claims that the deconstruction movement is walking away from the belief that women are to be submissive to men, right? He says that they're walking away from a belief system that marriage is a sanctity between one man and one woman, and that we reject homosexuality as sinful. He says that they're walking away from the American way of life as best concept, right? That's what he claims that Christians and evangelicals believe, is that America is life and America's way of life is the best thing. And then lastly, he claims that what they're walking away from is a partnership with a political and social conservatism. So he claims that anyone who's an evangelical believes that they believe in a literal reading of the Bible. They believe that marriage is something that should be held between a man and a woman. And if you're homosexual or any of the other gender ideologies that are out there, that's all sinful, and all those other beliefs that we mentioned. So he says that's what the movement is leading people away from. Not necessarily that there isn't a God. He considers himself more of an agnostic than anything, which means that he believes that there is something out there. He just doesn't think that we can get to know who that is or even have any concept of God, but that there might be a creator. But he says that's not necessarily what the movement's about. The movement is walking away from all of these things. Now, let me ask you this. As a Christian, do we believe some of these things? Yes, we do. But again, as this series kind of started off, definitions matter. You can't just loosely go tell somebody that marriage is between a man and a woman and nothing else. You have to be able to define what that is. Do we as Christians believe that the Bible should be taken literally? In some places, yes, but there are other places where the Bible's not meant to be taken literally and that there's more symbolism involved. But you have to be willing to define what those are. And if you don't do your homework and you don't go and search for the truth, you're never going to be able to have these kind of conversations, right? Is homosexuality a sin? We believe that the Bible is very clear on that, right? Are there more than two genders that were created by God? No, the Bible's very clear on those things. But again, you have to be able to define what you're talking about. And what's happening in this movement is everything's just thrown together under the umbrella of evangelicalism. And so that's why everyone is moving away from it. And so it just gets really interesting how it all kind of takes place. But here's where it all comes to stem from, right? Is Satan. Last week we talked about Satan being the deceiver of the world. But what does that look like? Satan uses about 3 elements to get you to deconstruct, right? The first one is that he makes you question what God says. So like I said, does the Bible say these things? Yes. And so what Satan will do is he'll throw that in there and he's like, does God really mean that marriage is between a man and a woman? Does God really mean that you cannot be homosexual? Does God really mean these things? And he gets you to start questioning these things. And even things like murder. Is murder actually considered wrong? And you could tie abortion in with that category too. Does God really mean that? And so you start thinking about these things and start wondering if maybe you're missing something, right? And then Satan moves you from questioning God to what he says to then all of a sudden denying God completely, right? And then when you start to do that, you go from that to then saying, who is God? And that's where you start to deconstruct completely. And so Satan has a motive for when he starts to question these things. And what's happening is that he's doing it with Christian people. And as these Christians are starting to analyze this and they start to question what God says, then they start arguing for these ideas. They start arguing for abortion or for homosexuality or for transgenderism or for multiple wives or whatever it is that you may associate this conversation with. And so then you get activists on that side who tell you, well, the Bible doesn't really mean that. If you go all the way back into ancient history, they had homosexuals all the time. And they start to spew all this nonsense to you to where you start to go, that must be true, right? And then slowly what happens is you start to move away farther and farther from God, whereas the deconstruction movement claims they're trying to lead you closer to God and away from the American way of life. And so all of that, I know we talked about a lot. That's a lot to study. It's a lot to take in. But here's where the problem lies, is that Satan's very real, and he is working within our culture, within our churches, and sadly, even in our homes. What is our job to do? Well, as we continue through this series, we're going to start navigating on how we can respond after we've defined what all this is. Now we can start looking on how to respond to the problem and hopefully one day make a difference in the positive for the kingdom of heaven. Have a great week, friends. We'll see you next time.